Hey guys, today I'm going to be deconstructing how existentialism is explored within Albert Camus' The Stranger. And obviously, this ties into the module A textual conversations module, comparing this to the Meursault investigation. So, existentialism is one of those concepts that can sound quite scary and quite complex, but really, actually, if you break it down in terms of the mentality of how things shifted within the 20th century, it's very easy to understand. And actually, our own mentality is very much defined by existential philosophy. So it'll make sense as we go. And it's really awesome looking at Camus' text with existentialism because he really actually defined so much of what we now consider as the key aspects of existentialism. So when we think about what sort of happened in terms of how mentality shifted over the course of the 20th century, it sort of started at the end of, well, actually started at the end of the 1900s where, the 1800s, where people started sort of questioning things like religion, and this came about as a result of the things like the Industrial Revolution, scientific discoveries, etc. But what's really key to note is that prior to the questioning of religion, religion really provided the basis of people's meaning and existence in life. And when you think about it, you've got to look at, well, what did religion provide? So it, very clear guidelines, like, if we look at the 10 Commandments, for example, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill. There's a whole framework of things that you can do and things that you can't do. And the whole purpose behind that is that it's going to lead to some kind of afterlife, right? So if you do good things, where are you going to end up? In heaven. If you do bad things, you're going to end up in hell, right? So the idea is that this life is all just, a practice run or like a precursor to the eternal life. This is like the test. And then if you pass it, you go to heaven. If you don't, you go to hell. And that's going to be eternal. So what that really provided for people was like a very clear purpose and framework for like how to live their lives and where they were going to go. And that provided a lot of comfort as well because, obviously everybody's going to die. So to think or to know for a certain fact, which is what religion provides, and very much provided back then because there wasn't as much questioning as say there is now, it really kind of shows that, we're headed somewhere and there's a point to something. So then what started happening is that religion started being questioned, and then probably the most profound impact on people's views towards things like religion happened during the beginning of the 20th century when we had not only World War I but World War II. And it was really after World War II that people's views towards religion and life just became a lot more bleak. So, and if you think about it, like with the amount of suffering that happened, the atrocities that human beings committed upon each other, think of things like the Holocaust and so forth, people really started to think, well, like, is there really a purpose? Is there really a God looking over and taking care of everyone? Are people inherently good? That's kind of what was sort of believed. And, no, not necessarily, and that's kind of that's a very bleak thought. And so when you think about the idea that there's no God and then therefore the framework that's been provided no longer exists and doesn't mean anything, and also it then takes away that idea of the afterlife. So, it's like, okay, we've got this life, it's transient and we're going to die and then nothing's going to happen after that. That's it. Right. So oh, well, if we're just going to die and nothing's going to happen after that, well, what's the point of life when all we know, the only certainty we have is to die? And that's where the mentality or this particular mentality really gets reflected very, very well, chillingly well in Camus' text. So you can see that when he starts off, he goes straight into the idea of death, and it's just so just black and white. People die and that's just what happens. And what people are really concerned about in this text is that Meursault does not show any kind of grief and no emotion, which kind of it actually is explained later, which is what's really interesting about it, is that in a way he's like, well, she's at peace now, and she actually got to live her life at when she knew her death was coming, like that was like a certainty for her. So similarly, when Meursault is about to be executed, he suddenly experiences this like profound sense of peace at the knowledge that it's all coming to an end, so he's actually able to really like enjoy the little things, like looking up at the stars and the air and all that, rather than when things are getting heated, like and he actually uses heat and sleep as motifs to reflect the oppressiveness of trying to like desperately search for a purpose that for him just doesn't exist in life. So if we have a look at the first line, so Mama died today or yesterday, maybe, I don't know. So the way that he describes it is a little bit like odd, because that's his mum. So you'd think, oh my gosh, like you that's like a really profoundly impactful moment. But for him, there's this insensitivity that comes out, or that's what we are led to believe. And you've got these truncated sentences, and there's just such a lack of emotive language there. And it's really like poignant, ironically, in a way that there isn't that emotion, because we expect him to be grieving. And then what he focuses on is, the old people's home is at Marengo, about 80 kilometers from Algiers. I'll take the 2 o'clock bus and get there in the afternoon. So he's very like, okay, this is what I'm going to do, and that's what I'm going to do. And for him, like, all he really knows for sure is like, obviously that his mum's died, and then he starts focusing on like the logistical necessities that follow that particular thing that's happened. So and as we go, and like, while it looks like there's a desensitization towards death, what we start to realize, particularly towards the end, is that it's really more about the acceptance that death is the only inevitable thing in life. And in a way that gives us some relief, so given I've mentioned that a few times, I feel like it'd be good to kind of look at that particular quote. So what does he do there? So he says, and this kind of maybe links to the idea of freedom, right? So how does he attain that freedom? So he says, so close to death, Mama must have felt free then and ready to live it all again. So there's that sense of freedom that comes through death. He talks about like when he knows he's going to be executed, that it has rid me of hope for the first time. In that night, alive with signs and stars, I open myself to the gentle indifference of the world. So it's really interesting how like he's used this idea of like gentle. So in a way, like it could almost be seen as an oxymoron saying gentle indifference, because they're not usually two words, are a bit opposite to be put together. But for him, the acceptance that there is no meaning and that he is indifferent towards the life itself, that is what gives him peace. That is where he gets this sense of like it being gentle. And what else does he use there? The night becomes alive. So that personification of like life now being lived when he doesn't have to have hope for life anymore or hope for the future. So it's very, very paradoxical. But, if you think about it, like we do as people, like we place so much meaning in particular things that we do. And I don't know, give it maybe a silly example, like, we think about an exam and how much a mark means in the scheme of things, like, oh my gosh, I'm going to fail. This is what it's going to be about my life and all these things. But if you actually just go, oh, okay, well, it is what it is. It happened. And actually doesn't mean anything in the scheme of things, because life is so temporal anyway. It doesn't mean that you necessarily have to give up, but it does mean that you don't need to be like so oppressed about the meaning that you derive from that particular thing that's happened. So it's kind of an interesting concept, and it definitely evolved as the 20th century moved on to looking at the idea that, like rather than it being like a form of like a depressing thing, like, oh my gosh, there's no point to anything, it doesn't mean anything. And, there's so many times where he repeats things like nothing matter. What would it matter? Like, it sounds like it's, almost depressing or, sad or whatever it is, but that's not what he's saying at the end of the day. He's just saying, if we don't You know, things happen and like they just happen, and there's no real reason that they happen. They just happen as they do, and it doesn't like need to have the weight and the heaviness and all of that we often give it as human beings, where we're kind of like searching for some kind of meaning and purpose. And you know, when he talks about you know, he's got the judge who just is like desperately trying to be like, why did you shoot at a body that was on the ground? Like, he's like, I don't know the answer, you know. So there's this like this why is like, that's desperate like search for meaning, and he's just like, there isn't any. So what? So yeah, hopefully that gives you a bit of an insight into, you know, what Camus sort of getting at, and how what he talks about really reflects the mentality and the shift in perspective that happened over the course of you know, the 20th century, or even prior.